Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished participants, good morning and afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Hairo Akopan, and I'm a member of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, PCCB. It is with great pleasure and anticipation that I welcome you all to the 2023 Durban Forum Deep Dive webinar hosted by PCCB. Before we start, we encourage participants to familiarize themselves with the meeting naked, which is currently projected on the screen. Please note that by participating in this event, you consent it to being recorded. Thanks to all participants for your interest in attending this event. A special thanks to those who join at difficult hours or experience connectivity challenges. Today, I will serve as the main moderator of the webinar, and we look forward to interesting and insightful discussions over the next 1.5 hours. The Durban Forum on Capacity Building is held annually during the Bonn Climate Change Conference in June, organized under the auspices of the subsidiary body of implementation. It is an invaluable platform where capacity building stakeholders from across the globe converge to deliberate on the most pressing issues in the domain of climate-related capacity building. This year, in line with the PCCB's annual focus area, capacity building support for adaptation with a focus on addressing gaps and needs in relation to formulating and implementing national adaptation plans, the 12th Durban Forum delved into opportunities and challenges for enhancing capacities for formulating and implementing NAPs. The fruitful outcomes have been well synthesized into a report that you will find in the chat. Among all the themes brought up during the discussions, a key topic was identified as the focus area for today's webinar: synergy and alignment between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in NAPs. This topic is both timely and critical, as it directly addresses the pressing challenges we face in building resilience to climate change impacts while mitigating disaster risks. The Durban Forum Deep Dive today will explore the vital role of capacity building in advancing our understanding and practical approaches in this field. Our speakers will also delve into the critical aspect of harnessing community engagement and preserving local knowledge and examine the intricate web of stakeholders and actors involved in DRR and climate change adaptation. In this journey of exploration and learning, we have gathered experts, practitioners, and thought leaders from diverse backgrounds and regions. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce the speakers of our gathering today. First of all, we have Dr. Animesh Kumar, the head of UNDRR Office Bonn. As the head of UNDRR Office in Bonn, Dr. Kumar manages the organization's global unit for climate action and comprehensive risk management, disaster data, and monitoring of the Sendai framework and SDGs. We also have Professor Ahmed Bayes from the Institute. For our next panelist, we have Exley Taloburi, Deputy Director for Disaster and Community Resilience at the Pacific Community in Suva, Fiji. He supports the integration agenda of climate change and disaster risk reduction in the Pacific region. He also has over a decade of experience in UNFCCC climate negotiations. So we also expected my fellow PCB colleague Kerissa Hobson. Unfortunately, she cannot join today. So welcome everyone. Stefania, did I miss someone else? Can you please confirm if possible? Because we have some last minute changes in the team membership, let's say, of today's event. So I want to make sure that I didn't miss anyone.
We also have with us Mrs. Pamela, who is from Uganda, from the Prime Minister's office in Uganda. She will be sharing with us some on-the-ground experiences from Uganda. So welcome also to Ms. Pamela.
Thank you, Stefania. Yes, welcome and welcome, Pamela. So next, before we start the panel discussion, I would like to remind our audience that Capacity Building team has created a Padlet page ahead of today's discussion to facilitate Q&A and example sharing. You can click the link in the chat and use this space to share your questions, thoughts, or any example that you have about today's topic of discussion. So, colleagues, let's let's start our panel discussion with Dr. Animesh Kumar. With your role as head of UNDRR and having worked in Africa and Asia Pacific, how well in general do countries integrate DRR in their NAPs? How does the UNDRR promote such synergies? It would be great if you could provide us with some successful practices. Floor is yours, Dr. Animesh.
Thank you. Thanks, moderator. And also welcome all colleagues, and thanks for inviting me to this very interesting webinar on a very topical issue days before the COP. So I would start by putting things in context, and specifically the report recently released just a few days back, the Adaptation Gap Report, which talks about how the adaptation finance gap is widening and estimated to be almost from $194 to $366 billion a year. And as of now, it's very intriguing and concerning that every sixth country in the world is currently without a national adaptation plan. On the other hand, we do see that 2/3 of the countries in the world have a disaster risk reduction plan, but the disaster risk component of international financing for humanitarian action forms only 4% of the total investment. So the point being here that we need to raise the ambition on adaptation. We don't have enough number of adaptation plan. We don't have enough financing for adaptation as well as for disaster risk reduction. And both in terms of coverage as well as for financing, we need a certain level of convergence between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. On the other hand, if that does not happen, the cost of inaction is also going to be huge because we'll continue fragmenting our very limited resources. So we have been working on this for quite a few years, and I would say that we have also advanced and evolved in our own thinking of how the adaptation ambition can be further enhanced by better linkages with disaster risk reduction. We have done some analysis a few years back on the levels of coherence, and we came out with a framework of how different countries fare in context of 5 scales of coherence. And this could be at the level of strategic, conceptual, institutional, operational, or financial. And then we ranked several countries across these 5 scales. And we found that we did some analysis and just published one report in the Caribbean. Earlier, there was a couple of years back, we did a similar report for Africa. And we found that the levels of coherence across countries between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation across these 5 scales of coherence isn't very high. It's actually very weak. However, while appreciating the value of coherence, we should also enhance our ambition, not only to ensure coherence, but take a step forward to promote and pursue integrated approaches. So we are transitioning from just talking about coherence towards moving towards a more ambitious approach towards integrated approaches. And what do we mean by integration? For us, integration happens at 3 different levels. One, at the level of policy or planning, second, at the level of institutions, and third, at the level of monitoring and evaluation. And if we have integration at these 3 levels, financing and its coordination of financing becomes much more facilitated and in many cases automated. So let me start by giving some examples of how these 3 different levels of integration are working or potentially can work. So let me start with the pioneer for this whole thing, and very happy to have Exley, who may actually speak further. The Pacific is the pioneer in terms of integrated planning. So starting 2010 itself, many countries in the Pacific have developed the Joint National Action Plans, the JNAPs as we call them. And these action plans consider both disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in a very integrated fashion. Among these countries, countries like Cook Islands, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Nauru, Tonga, have actually used their JNAPs to be used as a NAP, as a National Adaptation Plan. And we know of at least 2 of these countries, Kiribati and Tonga, which have officially submitted their JNAPs as the NAP, as a National Adaptation Plan on the NAP Central. This is a clear example of how integrated plans, DRR and NAP plans, can be repurposed to co-benefit both adaptation as well as disaster risk reduction, which are complementary in nature. Now, inspired by such good practices, the Pacific region at the regional level has developed a common regional framework called the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific. And it has already been 6 years that this plan was developed, where they have 3 very interesting goals. And why they're interesting, I'll come to that. One, the first goal is to strengthen integrated adaptation and risk reduction. Second, low carbon development. And 3, strengthen disaster preparedness and response and recovery. And the obvious question, and this is why it is interesting, one would ask, is that why is disaster risk reduction related topics distinguished between the first goal and the third goal? Why are they not together? And the simple reason is that risk reduction in terms of ex-ante approaches before a disaster could strike, the things we do to prevent a disaster is very much aligned with what adaptation seeks to do. And hence adaptation and risk reduction measures were combined together to form the first goal. The third goal is more about ex-post measures, things that you would do after the disaster has happened, or something which would happen, which you will take just before the advent of a disaster, basically preparedness measures. And these distinctions are important because the responsibility of adaptation and risk reduction vis-a-vis responsibility for preparedness, response, and recovery should belong to 2 different institutional mechanisms. It's the responsibility of the disaster management officers who actually are well versed with the ability to respond as soon as a disaster strikes or take action just before a disaster strikes. But the responsibility of adaptation and risk reduction should lie with the sectors, because that's where the real action happens in context of integration of elements. Now, from the Pacific, let me move to a very different model in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the country work programs were developed as part of the CDMA's Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy more than 10 years ago. And these were developed more than 10 years back and now are being revised. The country work programs are a very good basis developed across the Caribbean countries to become a common basis for implementation of risk reduction approaches, but also response and recovery. The current design and revision, because it's more than a decade old, of the country work program is a very good opportunity in the Caribbean, where they can be further aligned with the national adaptation plans. And that's an opportunity that we definitely need to harness. So that's about how integrated planning and policy can work or is working in 2 different and diverse parts of the world. Now, let me move to the second topic on institutional integration. Now, many countries in the world, and from our estimation, at least half of the countries in the world, from my own work, 37 out of 54 countries in Africa, have established a national platform for disaster reduction. These national platforms are multi-sector in nature. They have the membership of all the ministries which have anything to do with risk reduction, but also climate change, as well as forecasting measures like the meteorological department and the stakeholders. The coordination becomes a very much an automated process because of the representation that these different ministries and departments bring to a common value of discussion. Now, these platforms are working at a very different levels of functionality, but at least they exist and could be further harnessed to enhance the level of integration across institutions. But let's take a further step. Where is disaster risk reduction located also establishes a lot on the focus of that specific country. So, for example, in many of the countries, DRR portfolios are actually located in the ministries responsible for climate change or environment or natural resources, and not necessarily in the ministries of defense or civil protection or ministries of interior, as is the case with many other countries. Examples like Cote d'Ivoire or Togo or Lao PDR in Asia or Samoa in the Pacific or Czech Republic, Iraq, Mauritania, Oman, Tunisia, and many countries in the world where disaster risk reduction is actually located in the ministries responsible for climate change. What becomes more interesting is that many countries are actually seeing a shift in their institutional mechanisms, and they are gradually realizing that adaptation and disaster risk reduction are just not a function of implementation, but more so a function of coordination across different multi-sectoral organizations. And if we locate such functions in a sectoral ministry, coordination across different ministries often become a challenge. As a result of which, many of these countries have moved their portfolio on disaster risk reduction to the heads of the state office. And Uganda, Pamela is here and she can talk more about it, is a very classical example where disaster risk management portfolio sits in the office of the Prime Minister. So is the case with Ethiopia, which shifted its DRR portfolio from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Prime Minister's office, or Niger, or Tanzania, or even in Mongolia or Zambia, where they have shifted this the portfolio to the heads of state. Coming back to the Pacific, and I'm sure Exley will attest to that, that Vanuatu has an integrated climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction institutional mechanism and policy development process. There is an institution called the National Advisory Board on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction, which is jointly directed by the Vanuatu Meteorological and Geohazard Department, as well as the National Disaster Management Office, and operates as Vanuatu's principal policy, knowledge, and coordination hub. So there are some very classical and good examples where countries are taking very productive and iterative steps towards integration of institutions so that the implementation becomes much more coordinated. My last point on integration is in the context of monitoring and evaluation. We tasted some success in 2015, which we often call as the year of resilience, because the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and the SDGs were all adopted in the same year. This also gave us an opportunity to see, can we monitor the SDGs and the Sendai Framework in a much more cohesive manner? And we actually succeeded in doing that. So many of the indicators of SDGs 1, 11, and 13, the countries for these SDGs are not reporting separately or to the SDGs for selection of indicators. They report only on Sendai Framework, and we as a custodian organization compile that information and report on behalf of the countries for the SDGs. Taking a step forward, this is also becoming very much apparent in the context of Samoa Pathway, which is borrowing the indicators from the Sendai Framework, or the New Urban Agenda, which is doing the same. Coming closer to where we are as of now, the discussion on the global goal and adaptation is actually becoming very interesting, because adaptation metrics are being drawn often from what we are doing under the Sendai Framework. I have already presented twice in 2 of the GGA workshops, and we realize that there is a great buy-in in terms of ensuring that we don't duplicate the efforts which are already ongoing in disaster risk reduction. And DRR, including, for example, on the Early Warnings for All initiative, has a lot to offer in context of the matrix, indicators, targets, and data that can be of high relevance to the global goal and adaptation. I would conclude by saying that the concurrent midterm review of the Sendai Framework and the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, which are ongoing as of now and this year, is a very unique opportunity to take this one step further to ensure that we talk about integrated approaches between adaptation and disaster risk reduction. If you're really serious about both raising the adaptation ambition and also achieving it. So I'll stop with that and back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Animesh, for this insightful discussion on how countries integrate DRR in their NAPs, also how UNDRR promotes synergies. So again, thank you very much. It was very interesting and insightful. Let's now move to Mr. Exley Talebur, sorry. So given your extensive experience in the Pacific region, what strategies can be employed to effectively integrate this indigenous knowledge into disaster risk reduction and national adaptation plans, particularly in the context of Pacific Islands? What capacity gaps and needs do you detect in practice? Floor is yours, Exley.
Thank you very much, moderator, and warm greetings from the Blue Pacific, where I am joining you today. Also, good afternoon to those that are joining from Europe, Africa, and other parts of the world. Allow me to also acknowledge the intervention that has just been made by Dr. Aminesh, and also to thank the UN Climate Change Capacity Building Team for extending this invitation to the Pacific Community SPC to be part of this event and to share some perspectives from the Pacific. For those of you that are not aware, SPC is the largest intergovernmental regional organization in the Pacific focused on sustainable and resilient development. We have 26 members and over 700 staff spread across various Pacific Island countries. Specifically in response to the question that you have just posed, moderator, first and foremost is the importance of having the necessary enabling policy frameworks and structures. And Dr. Aminesh did talk about some of those policies that we have, both at the regional and at the national level here in the Pacific. The 2050 strategy for our Blue Pacific continent is our North Star and articulates our leaders' vision for our region over the next 3 decades. As I speak, our Pacific Island Forum leaders are currently meeting in Cook Islands to consider the implementation plan for the 2050 strategy. And in that 2050 strategy, the role of indigenous and traditional knowledge is key, and there is commitment to ensure robust and coherent data systems, inclusive of science and traditional knowledge, are used in decision making for sustainable climate action and disaster risk reduction. At the implementation level, SPC is a key player in developing and implementing the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, FRDP, which our colleague from UNDRR mentioned as well, which is an innovative regional approach towards the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction. The FRDP identifies the need to document traditional knowledge to improve understanding and application of successful strategies to increase resilience as one of its key priorities. At the operational level, SPC Strategic Plan 2022 to 2031 includes a dedicated focus priority on resilience and climate action, with a specific action for climate disaster risk information, indigenous knowledge, and the rights and the needs of the most vulnerable, informing decision-making, management, and response. Some capacity gaps and needs at the moment include one, staying true to the integration agenda and involvement of all stakeholders from different sectors, organization types, and governance level, including the empowerment of all persons within communities to respond to disasters and climate change. The second key need at the moment is to be able to influence global support for integration and coherence. Having little coherence and synergies between the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework at the global level, in our experience, is counterproductive to the integration agenda in the Pacific. My second and final point in response to this question is the need for meaningful engagement of communities and indigenous views during the early stages of national adaptation or DRR planning. These should take into account key gaps such as language barriers, cultural bias, and the time required to draw out indigenous reflections. In the Pacific, we realize that face-to-face and building trust are key to a genuine process and not a tick-the-box exercise. Traditionally, people have the wisdom to sense changing patterns of climate. Hence, decision-making processes must allow for consultations at the community level. There is also need to first do a stock take to identify which sectors are integrating already, what tools and approaches they use, if CCA and DRR indigenous knowledge is integrated into the policies, budgets, and plans, and then use that to identify the low-hanging fruits as a pathway towards achieving more long-term results. For example, Solomon Islands did a similar stock take recently and found several ministries made reference to climate change in their policies in a generic way, whilst only 2 ministries were really integrating in terms of developing climate and DRR vulnerability tools that were used to climate-proof their structural investments, and also recognizing that these tools had some generic references to indigenous knowledge and they were mainly scientific. Due to the findings from those stock take, the government of Solomon Islands identified target ministries to work with, applying a 3-tiered approach at national, sectoral, and community levels, comprising 3 key areas: planning, investments, and practices. Apart from assessing the governance structures at the national level in terms of institutional arrangements, policy, work plans, and annual budgets, the approach taken at the sectoral and community level focus more on integration, adopting innovative narratives such as using the term in-streaming than mainstreaming. In terms of capacity needs, a key one is to acknowledge that true integration is not a linear process. And in the context of indigenous knowledge, it means finding a balance between the positive and not so positive aspects of tradition. In the Pacific, We have many communities that stick with traditional practices. Even these practices are harmful to the environment in the long term and dangerous from a climate change perspective. For example, the slash and burn agricultural method with increased risk of bushfires across the Pacific. This practice needs to be managed, hence this is critical. This can be a sensitive subject as we are so attached to our rich heritage, but as change makers, I think we need to approach this in an unbiased manner. Awareness and education leading to ultimately behavior change is really critical. With that, I thank you very much, moderator, and I hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Exley. It was very informative to learn about strategies that can be employed to effectively integrate indigenous knowledge into disaster risk reduction and in national adaptation plans, in generally in the context of the Pacific region. Thank you very much again. And now let's move to our last panelist, Professor Ahmed Bayes. So it is a really pleasure to meet you. I'm alumnus of UCL, so University College London. So great to have you in our panel. So with your academic expertise in disaster risk reduction, how can we leverage the existing bodies of research and knowledge to enhance the synergy between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at both the theoretical and practical levels? Can you share with us specific examples that you find insightful in your own research? Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I hope you can hear me. Just I want to apologize. I had a family emergency, and that's why I'm calling from hospital, but that's all right. So yes, thank you for the invitation. And yes, I mean, we do a lot of research, but the question comes in terms of disaster risk reduction, DRR, and climate change adaptation, CAA. I mean, how we can transfer the research into practice. That has been always the question. And it's been 15 years. I'm from Bangladesh, but of course I work at UCL, but I do extensive research in Bangladesh because it's a country in South Asia, very well known probably by everyone for climate crisis and for climate change adaptation strategies, how they have implemented successfully. So I will bring one case study, particularly from the southern coastal districts in Bangladesh. And that area faces different challenges related to the climate crisis. For example, coastal tropical cyclone, sea level rise, salinity, then coastal flooding and erosion, and many other natural hazards that are prominent in the coastal areas that impact the local communities significantly, and also that impacts their livelihood. But we have been working in some coastal districts for about 7-8 years continuously, and where we try to implement different DRR approaches. For example, if you recall, back in 1970, during the cyclone Gorky, it killed in the southern coastal areas almost 250,000 people. And then our country, we got liberation in 1971, just after 1 year. And it's been 52 years, we are celebrating our liberation. But things have changed within this 50 years. But we have gradually implemented all those theories that we learned in our textbook. Okay, if you remember the disaster management cycle, from preparedness to response to recovery and mitigation, how we have implemented over the past 50 years. I just want to give another example. In recent cyclone, like in 2020, there was super cyclone Amphan. The death was reduced from 250,000 to just less than 20. And now there were two major cyclones in Bangladesh this year. And the recent one last month is Cyclone Hamoon. So the death rate really reduced from hundreds and thousands to literally zero. This year, zero death was reported. Even there was a super cyclone in July, August in Bangladesh. But what happened actually? What has changed in the past 50 years? I mean, we have improved the cyclone early warning system. Now have a very strong cyclone early warning system from forecasting towards implementation, disaster risk knowledge, communication, and also collaboration with the communities and different types of organizations. We have also implemented some structural mitigation measures as well. For example, back in 1970, we had less than 100 listed cyclone shelters. Near about 20 to 30 million people live in our coastal areas right now. But now we have 13,000 active cyclone shelters in the coastal communities. We have now hundreds of thousands of kilometers of polders and embankments to protect some coastal communities from flooding, and also those polders are protecting the agricultural land. So we have strong early warning system in place. We have local volunteers. Thousands of people are trained now. They know during the response time how to evacuate the people from those vulnerable areas to the cyclone shelters. We now provide for several days of free food and other necessary stuff for those who are taking shelter. We have now segregation for male and female in the shelter, and also for animals. They can bring their cattle and animals into the shelters. And also for disabled people, we have ramps and all these very modern tools and technologies out there, from early warning system, community preparedness, volunteers, and evacuation. And also afterwards, there are budget for recovery and many other elements that we learn in theory and practice. So it took us time, almost 50 years, to get from vulnerability to resilience. We call ourselves a resilient community to cyclone disasters and coastal hazards. People are so this is one classic example how you can bring your research into practice and really help people on the ground for frontline communities to tackle the impact of climate change and extreme weather and climatic disasters. So Bangladesh can be a real case study. Probably many of you have studied about it, how from 250,000 to almost zero deaths. But the loss and damage, other type of loss and damage remains significantly high. And probably for COP28, I was just reading that there is a loss and damage fund people are talking about, and I hope so that will be approved this year, and then we can really help the coastal and also other frontline communities who are facing the adverse impact of climate change. So yes, I just wanted to highlight how research can be implemented into practice, giving a case study from Bangladesh. So thank you. I want to stop here and take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and let me express our solidarity with you to overcome the situation that you experience right now. So thank you very much for your insightful and informative intervention and shared information. Now, colleagues, I have one more question for all of you. Considering the diverse expertise represented on this panel, what innovative approaches can be implemented to enhance capacity building efforts that bridge disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at both the academic and practical levels? If you don't mind, we can start as we did already. Dr. Animesh, would like to start to answer the question?
Sorry, moderator, I assume that we also have Ms. Pamela from Uganda as a speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor. I think Pamela's intervention is under the next session,
Okay.
which is dedicated
sorry.
on the glass. But thank you for bringing this. So yeah, if you don't mind, you can start answering this question, then I will give the floor to other panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, I think building upon my initial intervention and also very good points made by the previous two speakers, in particular, the importance of indigenous knowledge also points to the overall knowledge ecosystem in which we need to operate. I think I would point to three key issues here in terms of where we would need to go and what are the key enablers to action. The first is in context of the right data in place. Do we know how much we're losing as of now, how much have lost in the past, and how much we may lose in the future, the full spectrum of the data on loss and damage is something which is really not there yet, and hence we need to really strengthen our efforts, and also ensuring that we have a full-scale understanding of the changing dynamics of risk, both in terms of its changing complexity, but also its changing nature in terms of systemic and cascading nature of risk. So what we at UNDRR has been doing is to develop a very good data ecosystem, both through loss and damage tracking. We have already launched this system. It has been there in existence for the last 30 years. We are currently revamping it. 110 countries are currently using it to track their losses at the localized scales. Last year, we announced together with UNDP and WMO to have a new system in place, and we continue to work further on this. And this week, tomorrow and the day after, we're organizing a very interesting workshop here in Bonn on assessing the impact of slow onset events, which remains as a knowledge gap. The second area is the capacities of the countries to ensure that they have the right access to tools, guidance, and capacity to develop the right integrated policies. So UNDRR has a very interesting program called the Comprehensive Risk Management Program that we have been implementing in several countries. And through this, countries are benefiting in their own context to develop as much integrated plans and policies as possible. We have developed a suite of tools. One of them is actually on integrating DRR into adaptation. And this year, in June, at the subsidiary body meetings, we launched a very interesting thought leadership program on exactly the topic that we're discussing in this webinar on integrating DRR and climate change adaptation. Within 2 days of its launch, we had around 3,000 registrations. And as we speak, we have 8,500 people who have registered to this very interesting self-paced online free course. So this is something which is very important in context of having the right capacities in place. And finally, to identify when we talk about synergies and convergence between adaptation and disaster risk reduction, we also need to identify what are the common bases for implementation. Why would a country try to integrate their adaptation plans and disaster risk reduction plans? And I think we are moving towards a pace where the distinction between DRR and adaptation is dissipating. Let's take the example of early warnings for all. For some, early warning is an adaptive action. For some, early warning is a risk-reducing action. And for some, it's an action to avert and minimize loss and damage. We're basically talking about the same tool, early warning, but from 3 different approaches. Now, do we want early warning to be configured in 3 different planning processes and then 3 different planning processes looking for funding to fund the same thing in the same country by different ministries? So I think it makes sense that we move towards identifying those common bases for implementation. The early warning system is just one of them, but we also have nature-based solutions. We also have infrastructure resilience. We also have agriculture food systems. We also have environmental sector. So there are many common bases where we can identify to move forward in a more integrated fashion. And I must say that the international financing system should also track these growing realities where countries are moving towards integrated approaches, because we do blame financing that they are being bifurcated, but sometimes financing also bifurcates different planning processes in the same country. So I think we need to walk the talk that we are talking about as of now and ensure that we bring different varied points together rather than pronounce them any further. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Animesh, again, for your insightful experience sharing. If you don't mind, Exley, can I give floor to Ahmed in case Professor Ahmed needs to leave sooner? Probably, I don't know. So just that's why. Please, Ahmed, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with what Animesh said. I wanted to highlight how we can implement early warning systems more. Yes, I talked about we have a very strong cyclone early warning system in Bangladesh and of course in many other coastal countries and communities. But now we are planning to, from academic perspective, implement more advanced tools and technologies, integrating together like machine learning, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and working with meteorologists to improve the forecasting system. That is really very important. We can really bring some cutting edge technologies, for doing all those modelings, different types of climate modelings, and also programmings and working with big data. And I really here at UCL, and we are working with partners to bring new tools and technologies for much improved forecasting system, because sometimes we think, yes, you have three other components like risk, knowledge, forecasting, you have communication and dissemination, and of course partnership. But forecasting is really important. I believe we are still struggling to forecast any natural hazard properly. So there we should really invest a lot. And I found from the developing countries perspective, they really lack the funding and the skills and the tools and techniques there. That's why I always talk about, channelizing some funds. It can be the loss and damage fund, because we need to empower them, their stakeholders, their government officials, different organizations, community people, unless there is funding. Because I'm working in Bangladesh closely with other South Asian countries. I found the organizations like the meteorological departments, the geological survey, and other types of departments, they really struggle with skilled human resources. And all this, like we are always talking about WMO, they have huge resources, I mean, computational power, supercomputers, all these things. They can do all this modeling, and climate forecast. But think about when we are talking about all these frontline communities from South Asia, from small islands, from other global South countries, they truly lack these skills, resources, and funding. That's unless there is no funding available, we cannot achieve any of this for all these frontline communities. So I would again prioritize channelizing funds, getting approved for the loss and damage funds. Hopefully, there's a draft already out there. People are a little bit skeptical on how it will be handled by the World Bank, whether we can find some other alternatives, and many other questions are raising. But of course, there will be a second draft and final draft. Things will be resolved, and all these frontline communities, we can reach to them ultimately for greater impact and practical implementation to bring the real solutions on the ground. That is really important. So again, yes, this is what we call research into practice and impact, where we are highlighting now significantly, moving forward from writing books and journal articles. We have done it a lot, but now it's time to really implement that knowledge through indigenous knowledge incorporation and locally led adaptation strategies. So that's where I want to stop. And thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Thank you for sharing your insights. And now, Exley, I'm giving floor to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I do support the interventions that's made by my other two colleague panelists. And in addition to that, for small island developing states in the Pacific, capacity building is certainly a key priority. And I would like to add 4 additional points. One is the importance of integrated curriculum design. In our context, there is need to develop integrated academic programs that blend disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation across various disciplines. This, we hope, promotes a holistic understanding of the challenges and solutions. And in terms of what SPC has done, in the recent past, we have developed a certificate on DRM leadership, and most recently have accredited 5 new micro qualifications, which has also incorporated CCA considerations. Under one of our current programs, which is called the Pacific Islands Emergency Management Alliance, we are working with our regional university in the Pacific, which is called the University of the South Pacific, to develop a pathway for practitioners and students to do postgraduate diploma in climate change, which currently has a prerequisite of a bachelor's degree. And the proposal is that our graduates from the certificate in DRM leadership would be able to have a bridging that allow them to undertake the climate change qualification, and specifically targeted to students that wish to pursue career studies in climate change or disaster risk reduction or management. At the moment, there are also discussions in the Pacific. Few weeks ago, we were privileged to host Ms. Mizutori in Fiji, and in a discussion that we were part of, there's a proposal to look at having a professional master's qualification in resilience with the regional university here in the Pacific. The second issue that I'd like to raise is the importance of peer-to-peer learning. Um, this is not very innovative, but in the Pacific, it's still lacking. There is need to establish mentoring programs that connect experienced practitioners and emerging professionals. This would then foster knowledge transfer and build a sense of community ownership within the field. Here in Fiji, this was evident during the recent Fiji National Disaster Awareness Week late last month, which also involved in simulation exercises. And what Fiji has done was they extended an invitation to other Pacific Island countries to participate, contribute, and learn from each other. This also included the IFRC, for instance, inviting National Red Cross societies from across the Pacific to be part of that event as well, with the objective of peer-to-peer learning. This will be the focus of the Pacific Islands Emergency Management Alliance, which is under the program that I coordinate here at SPC, as we move towards a new phase starting next year, that we would also contribute to ongoing work that's done at the regional level, being coordinated by the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in establishing a regional coordination response mechanism for humanitarian support and DRR related issues. The peer-to-peer opportunities that present, the peer-to-peer opportunities ensure localized ideas are shared and enhanced from the bottom up, and not the current trend of global to national implementation. Recently, SPC has also participated in a transboundary risks conference with ASEAN to further discuss areas of mutual understanding and information sharing on emerging human security and climate risks. The third issue is collaborative partnerships. Under this, there's need to forge partnerships between academic institutions, government agencies, NGOs, and the private sector. Collaborative efforts can pool resources and expertise for more effective capacity building initiatives. Here in the Pacific, one example that I would use is the Pacific Resilience Partnership Technical Working Group, and also the recent Pacific Resilience meeting. This is the largest regional meeting we have in the Pacific. The last meeting that we convened on the 11th to 13th of October brought about 1,700 participants in 3 days. And this is an effort to bridge the gap between practitioners and ensuring that they take action on joint priorities that are identified by our regions and our members. USP and SPC are also developing learning pathways to bridge qualifications in DRM and climate change, as I've mentioned earlier. The final point before I stop, moderator: everyone's success, everyone's science, is everyone's business. What we have done at SPC, similar to what our UNDRR colleague has mentioned, is the need to communicate the scientific data that we have collected into a way that is easily understood by policymakers and also relatable to ordinary people and communities. SPC has recently developed 3-dimensional models on sea level rise for the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu recently. We have trained RMI's climate envoys, Tina Stige and also Kathy Kijna on the 3D model, and also youths from Tuvalu. And I'm pleased to mention today that these models would be displayed at COP28, showing what science is actually showing in terms of the potential impacts that these atoll island countries in the Pacific will face under the different sea level rise scenarios that the IPCC is telling us. With that, I'll stop and hand back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Exley. It was really, again, informative. I would not, stop to use that word to learn your experience related to this time innovative approaches that can be implemented to enhance capacity building and also bridge disaster reduction, climate change adaptation at both academic and practical levels. Colleagues, esteemed colleagues and distinguished participants, indeed, we kind of all look forward to COP28, where parties will be responsible for operationalizing, the fund. Hopefully, the fund will possess a capacity to disperse funds on time as the urgency of extreme weather events escalates. So based on the lessons learned from other operating entities of the financial mechanism of the convention, such as Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and Global Environment Facility. So thank you again for your excellent sharing. We will now move to our Q&A session. We want this Q&A session to be interactive, so we will move to the Padlet. You can use the Padlet to share your thoughts or any example that you have about today's topic of discussion. My colleagues will share the Padlet link in the chat, as you can already see. Our panelists will be able to see any question that you post, and they will answer accordingly as you write them down. Gentlemen, please feel free to answer the questions and comments that interest you on the screen. So, yeah. So we stop talking with having very informative intervention from Exley. Probably Dr. Animesh, there is no any question. So Ahmed, can you please answer the question? Can you see the screen?
No, sorry.
Can I read it? Yeah, for you, if you don't mind.
Read the question for me,
okay,
please.
Great, sure. What would you say is the main skill or capacity that was developed to more form Bangladesh from vulnerability to resilience?
Sorry,
you need me to repeat the question?
Yeah,
no
because
problem.
there is noise outside. Sorry.
So what is the main skill or capacity that was developed in Bangladesh related to vulnerability to resilience?
Yes, I mean, quickly in my understanding, that's the different government partners, NGOs, and local communities. They work all together in a partnership and collaborative method and approach. So I think that is the key to success, because I'm talking about many millions of people. I think we have right now, we're talking about 30 million coastal communities in Bangladesh. I think this is now 35 probably after the new population census. So it's a millions and millions of people out there. So unless you involve the local communities, who are the frontline communities there, because it is not about evacuation, early warning, and building cyclone shelters or polders. It is also about their livelihood is also really integrated within the entire ecosystem, because mostly they do fishing and agricultural activities. That's their primary source of livelihoods. I mean, protecting those livelihoods, public health is also integrated. So many other dimensions we need to consider. So I would always believe, yes, having ideas is important, having tools and technologies are important that we are talking about here, and also funding. But we need to really, again, it is the decolonizing approach, working with the indigenous communities, working with the real local communities, understanding their vulnerability, their need, and training, providing training them. all this should be as a holistic approach, and that really worked well in the case of Bangladesh cyclone disaster resilience. Yes, it was not easy. I mean, thanks to different donors, funders, and also NGOs for all those investment, for resilience training, different types of alternative livelihood training, and all these initiatives they have implemented. But remember, it took us many years. It didn't happen in a day or in few years. We are still learning how the climate is changing, how the pattern of intensity and frequency of cyclone is changing, and people are adapting to it. So yes, it's a learning curve and it takes time, but with patience, with investment, and with real collaboration between partners, donors, and communities, we can achieve any kind of resilience. I'm quite optimistic. We can really replicate this kind of method in other frontline communities, and I believe we will get success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Thank you. So actually, as you can see on the screen, you have two questions. So let me start with the first question, reading for the audience. What are capacities and skills specific to indigenous people that need to be strengthened to ensure the alignment, and who is better positioned to provide these capacities? Please, floor is yours, Exley.
Thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge the interest from those that are joining us today online and the questions that have been raised. Let me maybe start by responding to a question that I see in the chat box, which is whenever we talk about indigenous knowledge, where do we place local and traditional knowledge? As I mentioned in my response to the first question, some examples of how our key policies in the Pacific have attempted to incorporate the importance of indigenous knowledge. I think while that is a good trend, in my view, I think there is more that could be done in ensuring that those things also translate to accessing resources and financing, as others have mentioned today. So at the moment, although they are there and the importance of indigenous knowledge being referenced in our 2050 strategy, in our framework for resilient development in the Pacific, whether that also translates when projects are developed for the Green Climate Fund, for the GEF, for the Adaptation Fund, is another question. And that is something that I think we could learn from other regions if there are some success stories in that regard. For the two questions that are posed, one, I mean, around capacity skills and skills specific to indigenous people that needs to be strengthened. Here in the Pacific, I think the capacity building aspect is something that SPC has been focusing on a lot with some of our current interventions. I did mention one specific example, which is that Pacific Islands Emergency Management Alliance. That is specifically one question that one specific example that we have currently focused on building capacity, including for indigenous communities. And so at the moment, the focus is mainly around, for instance, building back better and infrastructural development, ensuring that infrastructure and people are more prepared and also can withstand the different hazards and the risks that we face. But where I see a gap right now, I think there's also need to focus a bit more on the importance of restoration and healing, particularly with some communities in the Pacific that currently are still fighting for self-determination, for instance. And so in that regard, I think this is where the importance of indigenous knowledge is important, because in our region, for many communities, if your state of mind is healthy, you can withstand any challenges and issues or adversities that you face. And so that's something that maybe for us as practitioners and partners, we need to also consider when we talk about building capacities for DRR and for climate change adaptation. In regards to whether there is any ongoing efforts to document, as I mentioned, there are a couple of opportunities that's currently happening in the Pacific, and one of them is using the Pacific Resilience Meeting that takes place every 2 years to allow a platform for our indigenous communities to share their experiences. And so the recent meeting that I talked about, which took place on the 11th to 13th of October, provided that space for different communities and indigenous representatives from across the Pacific to share their experiences and success stories in building resilience across the Pacific. And that's something that we convene every 2 years. And so the next meeting will be in 2025. And in addition to that, there are also other opportunities where we have technical working groups and technical working groups that bring together different stakeholders, including indigenous communities, governments, private sector, NGOs, development partners, regional organizations, and academia. I think those are some initial steps that we are taking in the Pacific, but more could be done to actually record and document indigenous knowledge and skills.
Thank you very much, Exley, for answering all questions. So, yeah. So I also want to thank all the participants who shared their questions. So probably as all the questions are asked sorry addressed, we can move the next session. So we will move to next session of the webinar, which facilitate the sharing of examples on the ground experiences, presented by Pamela Komujuni Kalule, Senior Disaster Management Officer, Department of Relief, Disaster Preparedness and Management Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda. Sorry? Someone's microphone is, can you please mute your microphone? Okay, thank you. So it happens. So yeah, let me repeat. Moving the next session of this webinar to facilitating the sharing of examples on the ground experiences, presented by Pamela Kamujini Kalule, Senior Disaster Management Officer, Department of Relief, Disaster Preparedness and Management Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda. Before giving floor to Pamela, you can also pose your questions and comments to her on the Padlet. So Pamela, now the floor is yours. And thank you very much for joining today.
Okay, thank you, Harapet. I hope you can hear me.
Super.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to request that I turn off my video if it's okay for bandwidth issues, because I don't want to drop out. But yeah, this is me. I hope this helps. So that you can put a name to the face. Yeah, my name is Pamela Komijuni, like you have mentioned, and I work with the Office of the Prime Minister, specifically in the department that is responsible for relief, disaster preparedness and management. I'm happy to be here, and good to see some of the old faces I know. Animesh, good to see you. And yeah, so I'm going to switch off my camera and then I'll get into the discussion. Thank you. I hope I got some bites properly. So I just want to share a little bit of the Ugandan experience regarding especially the integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change. So I hope I got that well. Wow. I don't know. I know this may not be a challenge in only Uganda, and I think the first talk from Animesh kind of hinted on how things are done differently in different countries, and also Uganda over the years, really, until, thank God, recently, it was always an issue of the chicken and the egg, you know, who came first. And I think that is a challenge that happens to most governments. The weird thing is, I don't know why we never get ourselves to, you know, reconcile some of these issues. But as a country, of course, yeah, we are fully aware of the impact of climate change and how it is aggravating already our disaster risk landscape. And as influenced by the hydrometeorological disasters, which are directly, of course, related to weather. So as a government, we are fully aware of our obligation really to ensure that the citizens, the communities, and generally the people of Uganda adapt to the climate risks, to the impact, by putting in place appropriate measures at different levels. Let me concentrate my input on the approach that we've taken as a country. So over the years, we're able to see where our major gaps, especially when it comes to the area of having coherent policies and coherent strategies that can be able to integrate disaster risk reduction and climate change. So one of our ways of going around this was to make sure that we strengthen climate risk governance as well as disaster risk governance. And this was in form of making sure that we have in place policies, laws, plans, and strategies. So a number of them have really come through. I think before around 2015, 2016, you realize that most of the policies we had, for example, we had a national policy for disaster preparedness and management. We had also a national climate change policy, which also had an implementation strategy. But when you review those two key policies, you realize that they were kind of not communicating to each other, yet the disaster risks we face as a country are really strongly interlinked. So, of course, that was a gap that was noticed. And when you even look at our first attempt to put in place the National Adaptation Program of Action, there was hardly any mention of disaster, risk reduction interventions and actions. So after noting those gaps, then we decided now to put in place some changes to make sure that we improve on the governance system. So at the moment, a number of changes have been made. We have a National Climate Change Act. At least there was a bit of integration there. And then we have a National Disaster Risk Management Plan, which has also integrated climate change and disaster risk reduction. And then our overall National Development Framework. Right now we are in the National Development Plan, the third one, which is the NDP3. There was a lot of effort, and that was a result of continued advocacy from both us in the DRR sector as well as our colleagues from climate change. We said we needed to see a closer working relationship and mainstreaming of climate change and disaster risk reduction across the different programs of government. So in the current NDP3, integration at least has gone a step further, to the extent that climate change, disaster risk reduction, we all contribute to one program. So at least we're brought together, and that's where we are able to, we share our plans, we plan together, but importantly, we also report together. And in between, we have mechanisms of doing reporting, monitoring, both on the ground, also at the national level, jointly. Recently, we even do joint assessments to make sure that when we are out there undertaking assessments, we are able to focus on both the indicators for climate change, indicators for disaster risk reduction, and to make sure that our interventions are communicating to each other. Of course, a few years ago, I think it was around 2021, UNDR actually supported Uganda to undertake a study on policy coherence, and that study gave us very insightful recommendations. And then all the interventions that have come after that, we always look at those recommendations, and then we are able to see how far can we go, or what can we do to make sure that we actually factor the recommendations to be able to address the gaps that we had identified as a country. Maybe another issue is just specifically on our NAP process, the National Adaptation Plan process. As a country, we really took on a two-pronged approach, whereby the first is to encourage different sectors that are directly impacted by climate change to develop sector-specific sector-specific NAPs, and our agriculture sector took lead on that. And that could also be because one may argue that it could be the most vulnerable sector to climate change, but we know all the other sectors are, but at least the agriculture sector was able to take lead and develop their NAP. So the one part of the approach was to have the different sectors develop their NAPs, and then collectively those NAPs can be analyzed to form one NAP for the country, one national NAP. So right now the process is ongoing to really come up with a comprehensive NAP, and part of the support is actually coming from the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and then we have other partners like UNEP and a number of government partners who are supporting the process. But importantly, we are making sure that the process is multi-sectoral to ensure that all the ministries, departments, agencies are involved, as well as NGOs, of course, the civil society. We have academia on board, we have communities, to make sure that it is as inclusive as possible. And of course, our focus is on to make sure that we put in place long-term, climate adaptation planning. And we are trying to adopt a bottom-up approach whereby risk assessments are not done in the boardrooms. They have to be done at the local level. And this process is spearheaded by the districts. Districts are our local level or the decentralized level of governance that we operate. And once these assessments are done and analyzed and submitted from that lower level, then they are sent to the center, where now the process for mainstreaming them into the broader government sectors and programs is undertaken. So also, as part of enhancing our bottom-up approach, a lot of attention is being directed towards creating awareness, especially on the climate change impact, as well as the target are the communities. And these communities, we identify them by using our National Risk Atlas, because the entire country has been mapped. We know which district, which communities are prone to which disaster risks. So we use the National Atlas to identify the communities.
It seems that we lost connection with Pamela.
Hello?
Hello, Pamela?
Sorry.
Yeah, we missed probably the last few sentences. If you can repeat the last few sentences.
I'm now using the phone. We don't have power in office, so I knew anytime the computer would go off. So I had a plan B, like a disaster manager that I am. Yeah, so I was, I think, talking about our approach, which is centered around communities, because that is where the risk manifests first. So we are really targeting enhancing awareness on climate change and disaster risk impacts at the community level. And
Pamela, I think we lost again connection with you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear again.
Yeah, so what I was trying to say was we believe that when we enhance, when we improve on the knowledge of communities regarding climate change, regarding disaster risks, then directly we are contributing to their adaptive capacity and, of course, ultimately building their resilience. So communities are our starting point. And after that, then we concentrate on mainstreaming, adaptation, disaster risk reduction into the different sectoral plans and budgets, like I had already mentioned. Maybe just to sum it up, I know I don't have a lot of time. As the DRR sector, we are looking at it in a sense that any investments that are directed towards the projects under NAPs, they do directly impact DRR, because I've already mentioned that our priority list of disaster risks as a country are hydrometeorological in nature. So it is in our interest to make sure that we coordinate, we collaborate, and we support the NAP interventions, the projects, because any interventions in that direction directly impacts on DRR, whether it is, projects around drought adaptation, whether it's on environmental restoration, whether it's tree planting, whether it is improving meteorological services, natural resource management, whether it is indigenous knowledge, whichever intervention directly contributes to disaster risk reduction. Of course, challenges are still there, but also we have also learned some lessons along the way. For example, in as much as this effort is ongoing, as I mentioned, these improvements have been getting better year after year. But of course, even then, we still see a bit, or probably a lot of uncoordinated efforts around implementation of the NAP activities, especially at the lower level, whereby not all stakeholders are yet fully on board. So we have not been able to assess fully the interdependencies between the different sectors. And of course, that slows down the progress. Then, of course, community ownership, like I've mentioned, community level is our target, but the ownership is still inadequate. So there's still need for greater involvement of the communities. And here we are focusing on making sure communities are involved, right from vulnerability assessment and all the way to the adaptation strategies, DRR strategies. And this is important because we want communities to own the whole process. This also, of course, includes the element of capacity building, because we need communities to be able to manage and implement activities. And I was actually very inspired by the examples from Bangladesh. And so that is sort of a goal we hope to achieve in the near future, to make sure that the capacity of communities has been well enhanced. Then, of course, collaborations amongst the various organizations is also still inadequate, yet it's very important. And this also involves bringing the local governments on board to make sure that they can plan and mainstream climate change and DRR interventions within their local plans and their local budgets for sustainability purposes. And then, of course, lastly, we see, yes, the projects are in place and they are all inclusive of DRR, of climate change. But when you look at communities, their livelihoods tend to be multifaceted. So in most cases, one project activity may not be sufficient to build the adaptive capacity that we are looking out for. So we are also trying to see how best we can work with the local governments to make sure we promote diverse interventions that address climate change and disaster risks, but also ultimately increase community resilience to the adverse impacts. The parting shot really is the other, as a part of the coherence agenda, we are looking at how we can continuously improve our exchange, our engagement, especially between the DRR and the climate change coordination mechanisms, because right now we have platforms, but we still have two different platforms, one for climate change, one for DRR, yet the membership is actually the same. So we have been having this debate for a while on merging the two platforms, but the point is who will host the platform, because we are located in two different entities. So that is work in progress. But then on a strategic level, we are developing joint mainstreaming guidelines for all the sectors to be able to mainstream climate change and DRR into their sectoral plans. And this process, we are working with the National Planning Authority, which develops the macro planning guidelines for the country. And I already mentioned that we do joint assessments, we do joint technical workshops, and now we are looking at doing joint projects. We have already started on some of those with support from partners like UNDP, UNEP. So we find ourselves developing projects which have clear activities that will contribute both to climate change and disaster risk reduction. I wish to leave it at this point for now.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you for sharing your experience, ground experience. And yeah, let me also share with you that Keritha Hobson, my fellow PCB colleague from Grenada, was supposed to facilitate the sharing of examples on the ground experience in the Latin American Caribbean region. But unfortunately, because of health reasons, she won't be able to join today. She went, as I mentioned earlier, she conveys her apology. So let us go back to the Q&A and see what question we have for Pamela or for other distinguished panelists. Can you please show the screen of the questions? Otherwise, let me also check the chat. So we have here one question. Let me check also the screen. So yeah, Pamela,
I was
I
looking
see.
forward to Carisha. We attended the same grad school in the Netherlands, so I was excited when I saw her name. It's a pity she didn't come.
Okay, great to know. So I see we have one question, Pamela, for you. Let me read the question for you and for the audience. What capacity building activities have you done so far with the community to enhance their knowledge about DRR and climate change adaptation? Please, Pamela, floor is yours.
Okay. So what our entry point normally is enhancing their awareness about the reality of climate change and DRR. And we do this through, in Uganda, we call them community barazas, but basically barazas, I will not call them really focus group discussions because these are really big. Like we communicate through the local leaders, the local council levels, and then they are able to help us mobilize the target communities. And then they come and gather in one place. And then we try to break down the technicalities around these concepts by working with the communities and engaging them proactively to identify the risks. And that's why I was saying that the integration for Uganda shouldn't really be so much of a challenge because most of our disaster risks are hydromet in nature. So when we are assessing, when we are doing a mapping for safe flooding, we go into the communities, we mobilize the communities, and then we ask them to actually tell us about their experience with flooding, and then they are able to give us their insights. And then we ask them on whether they have noticed any changes in terms of the rainfall patterns, in terms of the weather. Is it as they knew it many years ago? Have they seen any changes? To try and help them understand that the current changes that are causing erratic weather are a result of factors like climate change, but also we also bring in the factors where we know that they have played a role. For example, we'll be able to use that opportunity to educate them about environmental degradation, and we tell them how they're actually contributing to the issue. And then after that awareness and having that collective understanding and working with them to map their own hazards, then that is now when the adaptive interventions are introduced. For example, if it's a community where we are trying to do restoration of wetlands as a way of mitigating the flood impact, they are able to participate coming from that point where they know that their human activities, their land use activities, which are not controlled, have contributed to that challenge. And then we facilitate them, but then we'll make sure they are the ones who actually engage in the restoration. If it's planting trees, they are the ones who plant the trees, because that way we know that at least they will think twice before they cut the trees.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Distinguished participants, distinguished panelists. Now we have to move with the closing remarks because of unfortunately, because of the time constraint that we have. Now, let me invite the manager of the capacity building subdivision, Mr. Alejandro Kilpatrick, to provide his closing remarks. Please, Alejandro, the floor is yours. You are muted, Alejandro.
Thank you, Jairo. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, colleagues, wherever you are. First of all, a big thank you to all our wonderful panelists and resource persons who joined us during this event. Despite particular circumstances, really appreciate the commitment to join this event. We heard a rich variety of insights and inputs on issues on integrating DRR and NAP implementation, and also what are the capacity needs gaps existing and how they can be addressed. So really encouraging to hear how practical solutions, how case studies on how this has evolved in the future, the importance of indigenous knowledge and a peer-to-peer learning. I really like the introduction of this term in streaming compared to mainstreaming, the role of academia and moving forward from pure research to practical applied research and looking at the experience from Bangladesh and recognizing that these efforts do take time and require the involvement of all different actors at different levels. The importance of capacity building at the community level, as mentioned by Pamela and other colleagues, is worth mentioning. So very rich discussions, and I also thank the audience for their very valuable and pertinent questions to all our panelists. As you know, this is a follow-up webinar to the Durban Forum, and the outcomes of this webinar will be captured and will be fed or provided to the Paris Committee on Capacity Building as an input for their deliberations following up the Durban Forum. So very rich insights to help advance the work of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And a big thanks to you, Jairo, also for making the time for helping us moderate this event. And having said that, I wish to see many of you during the forthcoming COP at Dubai, and thank you very much. And would also encourage, if you have further information to our panelists and our audience, further information, case studies, please do share them with us because we would love to have them portrayed at our capacity building portal. So again, thank you very much and wish you a very nice day.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and distinguished participants and colleagues. As we approach the conclusion of the 2023 Durban Forum Deep Dive webinar, I am filled with gratitude for the vibrant discussions, valuable insights, and unwavering commitment that each of you has brought to this virtual gathering. Over the past 1.5 hours, we have delved into the intricacies of synergy and alignment between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in NAPs. We have explored the critical role of capacity building in fostering collaboration, enhancing knowledge, engaging communities, and connecting stakeholders. The depth and breadth of our discussions have been truly remarkable. As we prepare to adjourn this webinar, let us carry forward the spirit of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and action. I encourage you to maintain the connections forged during this event, continue to exchange ideas, and explore avenues for collaboration. The work we do here does not end with this webinar, but extends into our daily efforts to make the world more resilient and better prepared for the challenges ahead. Before we conclude, I extended my heartfelt thanks to our speakers, panelists, moderators, and the dedicated team behind the scenes who have worked tirelessly to make this event a success. Your expertise and dedication have been invaluable. In closing, let us carry the lessons learned here today into our work and communities, knowing that these actions we take in the field of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction can have a profound impact on the future of our planet. Thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to our continued collaboration in the pursuit of a more resilient and sustainable world. Thank you very much. Have a good day. It was a pleasure to moderate this event. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.